Our Brian Todd just flew over some of these areas, and he sent in these pictures so we can share them with you. He describes seeing thin fingers of oil starting to break through near the shoreline. The water in the Gulf, very turbulent today, and that's causing big problems. Whitecaps are washing over the booms that were set up to try and keep the oil back at the surface. You get it, right? It's just going over it rather than being held back. There's also some real concern for the wildlife preserves themselves just south of New Orleans. And there's also concern for the people who make their living fishing in the Gulf. Folks, the bottom line is this looks to be much more serious than we had originally thought, and certainly than some of the officials down there now scurrying about to try and take care of it had anticipated. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the president of the Waterkeeper Alliance. He's just filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of commercial fishermen in Louisiana. Just to let you know, we've also called BP for their reaction, but thus far they have declined our request for an interview. They also declined to give us a statement, both of which we asked them for. Robert, good to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Has the federal government moved fast enough, in your estimation, to respond to this oil leak?
Well, the question of whether they've mobilized fast enough, I think, is almost a side question. The problem really is the leak itself. There's a history of these leaks in the Gulf, not this big. We haven't seen anything this big since the Exxon Valdez. But this is really, as you pointed out, going to overwhelm the wildlife populations and the ecosystem south of the Gulf. This is one of the, it looks right now like it's hitting one of the worst possible places that it could hit. It's hitting this coastal wetlands south of New Orleans, which are the richest estuaries in our country. 41% of our seafood comes out of those estuaries. There are thousands of commercial fishermen and people involved who are in that industry whose jobs are now in jeopardy and whose property is in jeopardy.
Did you just say 41% of our seafood comes from those estuaries?
41% of our seafood comes from those coastal wetlands, including most of the shrimp in our country, most of the crab, large numbers of mussels and oysters, and then other fish populations. And we know that and Mike Papantonio is my partner, and we've been representing commercial fishermen for 25 years. Well, once the oil gets into that marsh grass, it will never come out. There's no way to get it out. You can't access it. A lot of the marshland, this is probably the wildest area in the lower 48 states. A lot of that wetland is 30 miles from the nearest road, and there's no way to get it out. We know that in Alaska, in Prince William Sound after the Valdez spill, we're now, like 26 years later, and the salmon populations still have never recovered. There was an oil spill 3 years ago in San Francisco, and today the herring populations of San Francisco Bay, 100% of the herring eggs are no longer viable, or they're grotesquely deformed.
Well, let's talk about balance, though, because, some folks are watching us right now, and they would say, my goodness, some of the numbers that he's suggesting, certainly 41% of our seafood coming from the estuaries in the adjacent areas. We don't know specifically what areas are going to be affected by this yet. But they're probably wondering, Robert, as they listen to you, but what are we going to do? We need the oil just as much as we need those estuaries. How do you strike the balance? Are you saying that we shouldn't drill and we shouldn't pump oil off that rich Gulf area that has so much of it?
Well, if you're asking, does America's future depend on oil, I would say that we, as a nation, that we ought to be moving away from our deadly addiction to oil, not only because of the damage that it's doing in the Gulf, but we are borrowing $1 billion a day in our country, mainly from nations that don't share our values, in order to import $1 billion of oil from nations that don't share our values largely, and many of them that are outright hostile to us. If you're saying to me, it's a good thing for our nation to be addicted to oil, I'd say to you, we are funding both sides of the war against terror.
Well, what I'm saying is we are where we are. It's not my liking. It's not most Americans' liking, but What could we possibly do?
Rick, if you want to argue about whether we need to continue our addiction to oil, I can talk to you about that. And, you know, I'm heavily into green tech issues, and I don't believe that we do. And I believe there's lots of money, you know, deployed right now by people who share my belief, who think that we can go to other means of at least fueling our passenger fleet.
And it's really, it's a credible and respectable position. But you know, let me just ask you, and I think I'm trying to get to what people at home, as they listen to someone like you who they trust, they're wondering, what did these guys do wrong? Were they careless?
Yes, they were careless. There are things that they should have been doing that they weren't. They should have had acoustic regulators on the site which shut off the spill at the source. Essentially, they explode the whole area and plug it as soon as they have a spill. They're required in the North Sea. They're required in Europe. But because of the oil industry's influence on the Bush administration, the Bush administration waived that requirement. So it made the oil spills intrinsically much more dangerous. The oil industry has been a very bad neighbor in the Gulf. There's been 858 spills, explosions and fires since 2001, and the government has essentially, the regulatory agencies have essentially turned their backs and blocked their ears as to what's happening. Now, if you want to know what the government should be doing now, the most important thing is to use mechanical means to keep the spill away from the coast. That means big booms and skimmers, and to deploy every boom, every skimmer they have along the coast to that area. I believe that the federal government, at least, is responding appropriately. The other alternatives they have are fire, burning it, a controlled burn, which is not a great alternative because it simply transfers that poison from the water to the air, and it will end up, you know, poisoning people, and it doesn't get most of it. The other, probably the worst of the alternatives is dispersants, which take that oil and essentially pump it into the water column. So good, it won't hit the beaches and stain the beaches, but instead it will get into the seafood, and it will be much more persistent for a much longer time. And that's one of the things that we want to avoid.
We're getting a wrap here, but before I let you go, could you explain to me one more time, because you're the first person who's explained this to us, and to all our viewers who are watching all over the country, what it is that you believe they were doing that the federal government, you say, let them do, that may have led to this problem. Explain that to me one more time.
There are many things that they should have been doing. There should have been a lot more federal oversight. And again, during the Bush administration, the federal oversight over these offshore drilling rigs was virtually lifted. It was the Wild West out there. The industry did whatever it wanted, assuring the American public that something like this could never happen. But at the same time, the regulators, where the regulatory agency was cut, the budget was cut to almost nothing, and the regulators that were running that agency were former lobbyists for the oil industry.
Well,
and one of the things that they did, one of the specific things...
I'm interested in that description you gave of the concrete plug that used to be used that wasn't used this time, you believe.
One of the specific things that they didn't do was to require acoustic regulators, which is a device that when there is a leak of this kind on the ocean's floor or anywhere in the drop pipe that runs from the drilling rig down to the ocean floor, there is a triggered explosion that essentially plugs the hole. And these are required in Europe, they're required in other parts of the world, but we didn't require them in the Gulf, which is, you know, one of the most important ecosystems for the United States economy and most vulnerable to this, and that is inexcusable.
That is a hell of an important point, and certainly something worth studying. And it's really been an interesting conversation to have you on here and take us through this explanation. I'm sure a lot of people have had their eyes opened in many ways to some of the charges you made. By the way, to be fair, we have invited BP to respond. We have contacted them throughout the day. We have asked them to come on the air. We have asked them to send us at least a statement, none of which they have provided us with thus far. Obviously, we will continue to effort to get them on. Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., my thanks to you, sir, for taking time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it.